friends, welcome back to Coffee Over Apples. My name is Steph. This is my monthly Patreon video in which I review a book that I've read recently chosen by my patrons, and then I make fan art for it. This is gonna be a heavy one, okay? I read In the Dream House by Carmen Machado, and I immediately gave this 5 stars. This book is so important. I cannot stress how important this is. This book has been banned in many places as not appropriate for young adults to read. And I will scream from the rooftops that I highly disagree. This is a memoir from a Latina author who was in an abusive queer relationship. This story was told in such a unique way. And what's important about this is that it focuses on this mental space of the dream house. If you're familiar with what a dream palace is or what like a mind palace is, it's a way in which people are able to kind of frame memories. It's also a method that's used in memorization, but like the mind palace being this place that is composed of different elements, different rooms, different doors. Some people use even materials that are mental signifiers to kind of compartmentalize information. And the author uses the idea of the mind palace in the most unique way. The titles are very important for the framing and the exploration of different kinds of literature that this book explores. So chapter titles such as Dream House as Time Travel, Dream House as Confession, Dream House as A Stranger Comes to Town, right? So the titles very much frame the vignette of this person's memory and experiences for us, because it's only snippets of a years-long abusive relationship, but the ways in which their life experiences prepare them to become abused, right? A lot of us kind of think that when we see something, we're like, how could this person allow this? How could this person fall into that? When you are being manipulated, when you are not being given the space to exist and to grow and learn to exist in the way that is true to yourself, the way that is you're forced to conform to society, it's not easy to say that you should just know these things are not just innate, right? Once we actually get the girlfriend into the situation, it starts off very sexualized. And I've heard this be used as a justification for the banning of this book in young adult sections. But I think that that is so important, especially for young people, to learn that just because a relationship is sexual in nature, that can feel like love, but that doesn't necessarily justify the behavior of your partner, right? That sex can be weaponized. And so we need to see them go through this in order to understand their feelings that grounded them to this person. It's really important for young people to know that all kinds of sex, regardless of your gender identity, can still be weaponized. And that sex, while it being a form of communication that can be used to express love, can also be used with malicious intent for the opposite. And the whole point of the story, while this person's abuse is domestic violence that is experienced across all genders, the point of the story is that she is in a lesbian relationship and that queer domestic abuse is taken less seriously. More specifically so, in this case, if it is woman to woman, right? We get different accounts of history, cases in which the abuser was given justice, but that it may not have been done with the due diligence that this case necessarily deserved, because a woman committing abuse is not taken as seriously as a man committing abuse. That the aggression of abuse and the psychological and mostly physical nature that it alludes to is a masculine trait, and that a woman is supposed to be nurturing and all of these things, but that is not true. It is not true that abuse in all of these aspects is derived from heterosexual relationships. And that the extreme cases that I think people might be more familiar with and that this book tries to point out are cases in which they are extreme, right? That there might not be as much nuance, that there might be more physical abuse, physical signifiers of the actions that are happening behind closed doors, because you don't necessarily have straightforward physical signifiers of psychological abuse. It takes more analyzation. You don't have these physical signifiers of emotional abuse. They come through in actions and choices and verbiage, right? I love the way that this author combined the history of domestic abuse in queer relationships and made it so that the points that were made here supported and gave more framework to anyone who was not familiar with the history and legalities of domestic violence in conjunction with their experience. Something that I thought was a really great framework for the story was that chapters alternated between first and second person. Chapters in which it was alluding to times when the abusive girlfriend was not directly in the relationship, building the house with them, building these memories, right, were situations more likely in which we got the author speaking and saying, I felt this. This is what happened. This is the choice I made. This is what I said. And situations in which it seems like it's a memory of abuse are written in, you did this, you said this, you thought this, right? So it can be seen as the author putting the reader into the victim's shoes. But I don't think that that was necessarily the driving force for that writing choice. I think what's really important here is that it's not about really putting someone else into their shoes, because we can't force someone else to have empathy for what they're going through. We can't force someone else to experience that trauma. We can only provide them with anecdotes and information. But rather, I think what this tried to do was that it separated the author from who they are as an individual making choices for themselves versus who they are as an individual when they think back to that time in which they were being manipulated or were making decisions that were a product of their upbringing. I think when someone goes through trauma and they eventually are distant enough from it in which they may have overcome it, or they're able to kind of reflect on specific memories, there's this kind of cognitive dissonance that happens. Part of a coping mechanism that I think is used for that is looking at that person's self in that time with an out-of-body experience and looking at them as, you are you, I was you, but you are no longer me. And that's what I think that this framework really tried to do. So while I get that there is criticism for the book as far as putting the reader into the victim's shoes is potentially also traumatic, but like, again, I don't think that was the point. Another reason why I think that this book was so impactful is because there's a section in it where it talks about how we see abusive relationships in movies and media, things like that, in the sense of justice has been served, right? We hear these cases that are not thrown out of the abuser either going to jail or like something happening, or like crimes of passion that led the victim to doing something to their abuser, right? But what happens when a majority of the time victims of domestic abuse are not given justice? They are, at best case scenario, able to find a way to distance themselves from that abuser, either because the abuser no longer has a use for them and has moved on to another source, or that they were able to figure out some way in which it is no longer conducive to the abuser to stay within proximity of the victim, allowing the victim to regroup and move on with their life, basically reconstructing their life from the ground up. And what we don't hear enough, again, is the most likely scenario in which what happens if you're just expected to move on with your life and there is no justice. That person is still out there potentially abusing someone else, but you don't necessarily have the tools to be able to bring that person to justice, nor do you have the emotional wherewithal to do so, because that's exhausting. I say that to say that if for some reason the other parts of this story just don't click with anything, the ending of this is significant because it is a common ground that a lot of victims of domestic abuse can probably really ground themselves on, and know that there are networks of people out there in which they can look for support. So I hope that you like this. I hope that you read it, that what I've chosen to doodle here kind of reflects that. So I will definitely be reading probably everything else that this author has ever written, because I cannot tell you how impactful this book was, and might be in like a new top list of favorite books of all time. I don't know. Definitely worth a reread. Anyway, I highly recommend it. 5 of 5 stars. Let me know in the comments what you think, and I post videos whenever I feel like it. Thanks for watching.
What's it making, Mr. Wonka? Mr. Wonka worked the factory.
In your wildest dreams, you'll put out the measures.